All right, so we've got the dedicated group here today, since I made known there's no incentives tied to class in terms of iClickers anymore. But we will be doing kind of some additional last and new stuff will be today and maybe trickle into Friday a little bit, but then Friday and then Monday's class will primarily just be doing review. So I'll try I hope to have the time to put up some videos of me working through some of the problems. That way we can work through whatever problems in class, but you'll also have video of me working through the other problems that we didn't get to, so that you'll really have kind of a lot of resources as you're studying for that final next week. I also yesterday went through, updated any excused absence on Canvas, and then determined everybody's 3 lowest iClickers, dropped them, and kind of reported what your iClicker kind of category grade is for the semester, right? Reflecting those lowest 3 scores being dropped. So that's now it's kind of counting towards your grade. I still left up this category, which shows you kind of each individual day's iClicker scores and kind of shows you, which ones, what your score was in every day. But this is the one that reflects, this is what's going towards your grade, reflects me dropping the lowest 3, okay? Once we have that due date passed for those homeworks, so after next Monday, on Tuesday, I'll kind of download the data, drop everybody's lowest homework, and do a similar thing for your homework score as well, okay? Now, once you have those, you can even use your current, kind of see what your current homework is on the ones that have been graded. But I put up this figure out your grade thing. It's relatively easy for this class, I think, because everything is weighted kind of equally. But in Canvas, you'll be able to, I had some stuff open from my other class. You'll be able to see what your homework grade was, what your kind of iClicker where the lowest drop was. So maybe you get an 80 on the homeworks, 90 on the iClicker. You can put your 2 exam scores, your first 2 exam scores, and then play around with, okay, what do I need on the final to get different grades? So maybe this person wants to know, what do I need to get a 70? Looks like, 59. So basically, if this person got a 60 on the final, that would push them over the edge. You can then play around with, okay, what would push me out of like all the way down below a D minus? Let's say 35. You'd still end up with a D. Even if I got nothing right, I just barely fall on the other side of that D and F line. Right? So you'll play around with this once I have kind of that iClicker and homework grade up there. I mean, you can see what it currently is, but like once they're all turned in and I drop the lowest, you can start to use those values and get a real accurate idea of how you need to do on the final. It'd be nice if I think professor gave these to you. That way, you know where you can kind of allocate your time resources in that final exam week. Right? Any questions on anything related to that or kind of upcoming here? Yeah.
One of our homework will be dropped, right?
Yep. Yeah, so if you do the first 5, you don't really have to do the 6th one, because if you get a 0 on it, it would just be the one that gets dropped. Yep. But if you've missed one already, you really want to make sure you do that 6th one, right? Yeah. Any other questions? All right, so I put up some additional slides on Canvas and called it, I think, additional topics. So it's still related to the labor market, but we can start to think about some things like discrimination, right? So if we look at labor market discrimination, right, there's significant differences between the income earned by kind of different race, gender combinations, right? So what I have, white males earn 21% more than white females, 24% more than black males. You can kind of do these cross comparisons. You can break it down by every kind of race class or race status. And, it's troubling that we see these disparities, right? So there's a lot of explanations for why there might exist differences across these groups. And maybe we want to understand those factors. And then if we can control for those factors, do we still see discrimination existing? So one thing that we see right off the bat is that there's a discrimination in human capital, right? So we talked last class about the effect of human capital, right? We said that it increases the demand for that person's labor because their marginal productivity of labor increases, and potentially they put themselves in a group where there's a lower supply, right? If I get enough human capital, think about this as like a college degree or a graduate degree, I might then belong to a group where the supply of us are lower. That supply kind of decrease also pushes up the wage. So if we've got kind of this discrepancy across race, gender groups, right, where some of them are more likely to have a college degree, well, then that's going to drive income or wage differences, right? So it's not that we really need to solve, like, it's not like the companies are discriminating per se, right? But it's that somehow in society, we aren't kind of promoting this human capital acquisition the same, or at least maybe we need to look more into the opportunities that exist, right, between these different kind of race gender combinations. Okay. So, you know, it really goes back to this human capital, right? And if you can increase the human capital for this group that has on average lower wages, well, then you can get more equity, right? More income equality across race or across gender. Right? So we really should be pushing for kind of, you know, access to the same sort of human capital, same sort of schools, same quality of schools, right? If we can do that, and just to kind of review what we did last class, and think about this one. Let's start on me. Our wages here. Even if the supply of skilled and kind of unskilled workers, right, was the same, we know that the demand curve for labor for unskilled workers, right, they're not going to have as high of a marginal product of labor. If we remember, the demand for labor is just the price of the product they're selling times the marginal product of that labor. Well, if I have human capital acquisition, I'm increasing my marginal product of labor. And so we would expect the demand for skilled workers to be much higher, and the equilibrium kind of wage for this is skilled, and then this is unskilled. All right. So if we have differences in groups where one group is more likely to not have that additional human capital, if we can ensure that they have access to the same quality of schools, public education, where they can increase their human capital, potentially can increase their demand curve until we get kind of the differences, right, eliminated, right? If we can get these different groups to have the exact same sort of skill acquisition, or think about it as the same percent of those groups have a college degree or whatever it is we're measuring in terms of however we're going to measure this human capital. If we can get those to be identical, then we should see no discrimination existing. Any questions here? Okay. So it really looks like it, you know, just looking at these numbers, the fact that white males are 75% more likely, right, to get a college degree, that's the thing that we need to change, right? And maybe it goes all the way back to primary school, right? K through 12, where we just have different, you know, differences in the quality of schools that are available to different minority groups if we kind of break it down on average. So, you know, maybe it's, maybe it goes not even just to college, it goes all the way back to kind of that K through 12. Okay. Now, there's still maybe kind of discrimination going on, the access to education, but it's not necessarily like the companies are the ones that are discriminating in terms of the wages that they pay. So there's this really interesting really interesting study that someone did. And they basically took resumes that were identical, right? And I can't remember if this is the one where they set up LinkedIn pages, but they applied to all these different positions. And it was an identical resume with the exception of the names they used, right? So what they did is they took names that sounded like they might be more likely to be non-white, and then names that they think are more traditionally associated or have the connotation of being white names. And they sent out these resumes, but they're identical. So you've got two individuals who on paper look exactly the same, but employers might be able to kind of identify based off the name, or at least they might suggest that what the race of the individual was. And what they found was that these names that were more traditionally kind of European like sounding names were 50% more likely to get like an interview or kind of a callback from these different companies, right? So, you know, this human capital story is part of it, right? These human capital differences are causing wage differences across kind of race groups or racial groups, but there's also strong evidence that we still see discrimination, right? I mean, they're otherwise identical resumes. There's no reason why we should have seen a 50% more likely to get an interview here from kind of these more traditional European names. Okay. So, you know, there is evidence that there is labor market discrimination. I think here was kind of the results that they had from the table or from the paper. So you can kind of think about kind of these names that they had in the different kind of groups. And you kind of see here, the percent callbacks are much higher for the white kind of European sounding names as opposed to more names that might be associated more with kind of non-white, right, or non-European. So this is bad, right? This is not good, right? This is bad for society because these individuals, if these were real people, like this study, these were fake people, right? But if these were real people, right? I mean, this is leading to not just, you know, ethical issue, right? Ethical, like kind of surplus loss, but it's also like efficiency surplus loss, right? These individuals might actually be the more effective worker, like have the higher marginal productivity of labor. But because of this discrimination, society doesn't able to realize that productivity because they're not getting the callback, right? They're not getting the interview. So, you know, we can think about this, there's loss ethically, but there's also loss from production as well. And I don't know, this is, I think, kind of a hallmark, interesting paper. I think they mention it. If you guys have, you know, if anyone's interested in, or you know, enjoys economics here, there's a book called Freakonomics, which is like fascinating. So this is one of the studies they talk about, and they dive into like drug issues and like all these other things. But this was one of the papers that they specifically kind of talk about in that book. Pretty interesting. Interesting, but also sad, right? So if we think about discrimination that comes from employers, it may not just be a result of, you know, race or gender or these kind of more traditional things we think about. It may be discrimination based off of, you know, the way that you dress, right? Or you know, name your maybe age, right? Anything. Okay. So part of kind of the problem with discrimination. So we think about gender discrimination. Let's assume for a second we've got the exact same supply of both males and females. And I've kind of simplified it by drawing like there's a fixed amount, right? So everybody would be willing to do this job. We have an identical number of males and females here. We then think about the demand curve for both of those, right? So let's say that male and female workers have identical productivity measures. Like there's no differences in the skills for whatever position this is, okay? Excuse me. So without discrimination, right, we should see identical wages between these two groups, okay? Oops, there we go. So suppose that some firms are going to discriminate against female employees. So I show you some negative things, but here's at least a positive kind of conclusion using economic principles about discrimination that could exist. So suppose some firms are discriminating against female employees. So they're going to hire fewer females than males, right? So for whatever reason, that firm's demand curve for female employees is lower, right? So the way that we sometimes think about this, and I usually don't, you know, necessarily model it this way initially, but also, does this look straight to you guys? It's not crooked, is it? Okay, I'm writing on a slant, so I'm trying to. So let's say we got something like this, and I kind of made supply real easy, where the supply for males was the same as the supply of labor for females. I then had this demand curve for labor from males. What we sometimes think about is this demand curve for labor is the price times the marginal productivity of labor, right? But I said that this was the same between males and females. So what is going to cause this lower demand for female employees? Well, maybe the employers have what we call a taste for discrimination, right? Or that employing females for whatever reason, right? This was the value to the company before. For whatever reason, because of their discrimination, it incurs a psychological cost, right? Like if I really, I don't know, like this is, this is going to the extreme. If I really like, hate female employees, then if I have to employ one, right, there's going to be some psychological cost. So the value to me as the employer goes down, right? That's kind of how we think about this. It's imposing these additional costs because this company discriminates or like wants to discriminate against this group. So, right, it would decrease our demand curve. And we said, predict that there would be higher wages for males than females because of that discrimination. Now, the problem is, if that's the case, this demand curve for female employment is really like a fake valuation of what they bring to the company, because this is the value they bring to the company, but the demand curve was including this additional cost because this employer wanted to be discriminatory. So when you think about the worker who's being paid here this lower wage, that wage is far below what their actual contribution to the firm is. So if I'm a firm that isn't discriminatory, and I look at this firm who's paying females these lower wages, but I know that the value of those female employees is way higher than that wage they're getting. If I'm not a discriminatory firm, what would I do? I'd hire female employees, and not only would I hire them, right, I would pay them, right, something in this range so that I would attract them away from these discriminatory employees, right? And I could still, like, even if I offered them this wage, it'd still be below what they bring into the company, and the outside wage if they worked for the other company would still be lower, right? So as long as there's a non-discriminatory firm out there, they would always employ that female employee, and really, well, they're still paying them less, but they're getting paid more, right? But here's let's walk through it. That's one other company, right? So if there's only one other company, they can get away with paying them just slightly higher. But what if there's two other companies that aren't discriminatory? So if the one non-discriminatory company offers this wage, what's the other one going to do? Slightly higher. And then what's the other one going to do? Slightly higher. It's almost like we go back to those oligopoly models, right? So as long as we have two other firms or two other companies who aren't discriminatory, basically that competition would drive the wage to be right back up to what the demand curve should be and eliminate kind of that, right? Because there is no cost to those non-discriminatory firms. So as long as we can get two other companies, right, to be non-discriminatory, the discriminatory firm doesn't matter, because what's going to happen is all the female employees will end up at the non-discriminatory companies, right? Yeah. Made the wage the same as down here?
Yeah, so like you said, you need a meeting.
Well, if every firm says we're going to discriminate against female employees, then yeah, then you're back to where the original scenario, right? But there's always going to be incentive. If they truly aren't discriminatory, there's always an incentive to be the one firm that offers a slightly higher wage, because you then know I can attract away that employee who's much more productive than that wage. And then you kind of have this back and forth competition, right? But yeah, if every company is discriminatory, we're right back where we started. So I think I have this kind of walked through, right? So you've got this wage differential. However, there's just another non-discriminatory firms out there. They'll kind of continue to pay them slightly higher wages up until the point where you get back to the wages being the same. This might not happen immediately, right? Like job transition does take time, but kind of the long run equilibrium here would be that we end up with wages that would be the same between these two groups. I don't know if I'll walk through this. Come back to this in a second. So, one thing that you can think about, since I already used this example of kind of gender kind of pay discrimination, But if you look at within, even the same kind of industry, right? I might have kind of female workers earning less than males at every single one. So you can't, even if you control for the type of job, or at least the type of sector, it looks like kind of female earnings are much lower than males. So we may still have some of this discrimination going on, right? So you may have that it is consistent across these companies. Now, one thing over time, though, we are seeing kind of that gap is going down. So if you think about like the growth here, right, we're seeing growth for both males and females from having like a college degree versus a high school diploma. My stats class, we look at this data set. Almost I think it's 80% of universities have more female undergraduates than male. So we would expect maybe over time, right, that human capital kind of could, like if we go back in time, there was differences in how much, what percent of males and females had college degrees. Now, if we're looking at it, females are making up a larger percent of the college population. And so hopefully, just similar to what we talked about earlier, any difference in pay that we see for males and females that result because of human capital, that's going down, right? Because females are actually, obtaining human capital at much higher rates than males right now. Okay. So we should be seeing that wage differential gap decreasing, similar to what we were talking about before, because of that human capital kind of gap closing. So another reason why these gender pay gaps, it's always interesting because you hear like, you'll hear the 70 cents to the 79 cents or something to the dollar, right? Well, that's just looking at averages, right? So that's not controlling for human capital, right? Education levels, that's not controlling for the type of job. So there's a lot of kind of research out there that's been done to try to control all these factors, right? Because we know if we just look at the numbers, women tend to choose certain career paths at different rates than males. So I think here, if you look at the most lucrative majors, so we're thinking about things like, petroleum engineering, metallurgy. The percent of females in those industries are relatively low, right? But those are some of the highest paying majors. Now, maybe the issue is that women aren't being pushed towards those majors, or even being suggested those majors, right? So once again, here we can see there's a human capital discrepancy between males and females. So the question becomes that we know that that's going to cause wage differences. So how can we close that human capital discrepancy, right? That should be the question. The question shouldn't be whether or not we see discrimination from employers, which we very well might, right? We want to shut that down, but we've already got laws against that, right? We might want to police a little bit more. But if we ignore this human capital discrepancy, then we're always going to have a wage differential, right? So what we want to try to do is close that human capital discrepancy between males and females. That way we can kind of push those demand curves to be closer together, right? And close that wage differential gap. So not only do we see kind of lower percentages in these higher paying jobs, but look at the percentage of women in lower paying majors, that tends to be relatively high. This one is always wild to me. Like early, like you think about educate, like I forget what they call, like an education degree, right? From this data, it was 97% female, right? A very low number of males. But high school teachers, elementary school teachers, they don't make a whole lot of money, right? So in order to kind of compare apples to apples, we would want to make sure that we see like a 50% breakdown, right, across all these majors. Now, should we be pushing for that? I don't know. That's an issue way outside of my my wheelhouse, right? But just looking at these numbers here, we know we're going to have human capital differential, right? And if we want to see wage differentials go down to zero, we'd have to close that human capital differential as well. Is this making sense? Any questions on this? Okay with this? All right. Because you can kind of see these, I think just the numbers, like I can, you take these high percentage female majors, low percentage female majors. I just look at the differences in the wages here, right? So if we have these differences in major choice, we're for sure going to see, 79 cents to the dollar when we just look at the average wages. we could go through some of this. There's like a bunch of data out there. Some of them are interesting. So one is that we see, if we just look at the number of hours worked, it tends to be a little bit lower for females. Now, this makes a little more sense since we kind of have this traditional, it's probably changing over time. Like if we look over the last 50 years, this is changing. So this is becoming less and less of a thing. But on average, if we look at the average numbers, women are more likely to stay at home with a child. They're more likely to spend more time taking care of a child. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's just what the data says right now, right? So if we could make that more equal, then we could eliminate some of the wage differential gap that's existing because of that. Some other research has found that a major kind of driver of this wage gap is also that we don't have guaranteed paid maternity leave. So if you look across countries, the wage differential between males and females is much lower in countries that have guaranteed maternity leave versus not. So that's one thing we could do in the US to kind of help close that gap as well. Over time, this is going to go away because, if we think about, you go back 30, 40 years, I would argue there was a lot more open kind of discrimination and barriers to women into certain career paths. So even 30 years, removed from that, you're still going to have that causing there to be differences in experience levels in workers, right? Because if I couldn't even enter this market 30 years ago, well, then there's no way I'm going to have as many years of experience as the average male in that industry. And so over time, as we're moving further and further away from some more of that open kind of unregulated discrimination, hopefully we should see that gender pay gap going down because of that as well. We're getting experience levels now that look more similar across males and females in different industries. And then another one I think is interesting. So this was a paper that came out in 2003, and there's been subsequent studies. But this is something that like maybe you could even teach at the undergraduate level. You could teach it at definitely at the MBA or graduate school level. But they took a bunch of MBA students from Carnegie Mellon, and they really surveyed them about their interviews and the process through which they got their first salary after they obtained their MBA degree. Right? And what they found was that 57% of the male MBA students reported that they'd had some negotiation in their salary, right, for their salary. So, the company offered them something, 57% of the males had a counter offer, right? They said, I want something a little bit higher, right? There's this back and forth, right? However, they found that only 7.6% of the females reported that they actually kind of had any negotiation or any bargaining between them and their first employer after obtaining the MBA. So right away, that's going to cause huge wage differentials, right? Because if they don't come back with a competing offer, they just accept that lower wage, right? The company probably threw that out there thinking, I'm going to kind of throw out a lower number. They'll come back at me, we'll kind of go back and forth. But if you never have a competing offer, never give them an offer back, and you just accept what they give you, well, for sure, we're going to see kind of wage differentials. So part of this could be, maybe teaching these skills, right, of negotiation, or making it more known that negotiation isn't being rude, it isn't being all these other things. Why these differences exist between males and females. Once again, not my wheelhouse. I don't know why here men would be more likely to negotiate. I know there's a lot of studies out there that men are always willing to accept higher risk. So like if you look at investments between males and females, males have a much higher threshold for risk. Females tend to have higher risk aversion measures. So hopefully if we could maybe teach, right, the tools of negotiating, we could even close the gap between that kind of those wage, male and female wages as well. So these are all kind of areas in which they're driving still this wage gap that we see, but they're all things I think that, we could resolve, right? This is an interesting study that I wanted to kind of bring up today as well. So what also could be driving part of this, and this is also very troubling and sad statement about society, but there was this team of economists, so Hammermesh and Biddle, and they found that what their ultimate question was is there discrimination going on in terms of wages because of looks, right? And so their thought process was, if people on average are better looking, maybe they're given a little bit more leeway, or they're given more opportunities, and maybe we see they actually earn higher wages, right, or higher salaries. So their ultimate findings were that, excuse me, that people who are deemed to be more attractive earn 5% more on average than what they call average looking people. So I'll show you a little clip here. It's kind of interesting, but this graph really tells it all. So similar to that study I mentioned earlier, so what they did was they had identical resumes. They went on, this is the one that used LinkedIn. They then went on LinkedIn and said, okay, identical resumes, but we're going to use pictures, right? They uploaded pictures of different individuals. And then the pictures they uploaded, they had like a separate group of a couple hundred students, right? Like grade these people's attractiveness, right? Once they had them grade the attractiveness of all these fake photos they were using, they put them into percentiles, right? So whoever scored the highest, right, was like in the 100th percentile for looks. Whoever was kind of given the lowest score by these 200 or a couple hundred students would be in the 0th percentile, and then kind of the ordering from there on up, right? So what they found was that as these photos they were using were in a higher attractiveness percentile, the number of interview requests that these identical resumes were getting was a little bit higher for men, right, who were on that high end of the attractiveness rating. But the effect of kind of those photos being a higher attractiveness rating, right, for women, they got a significantly higher number of interview requests if they were in that upper upper kind of right side of distribution of those higher percentiles versus the lower ones, right? So we shouldn't see this, right? Well, I mean, you're whatever I mean, unless you're trying to be like the spokesperson or something. If that's the job, maybe they want the face of the company to look a certain way. But in terms of these very normal jobs that they were applying to with this identical resume on LinkedIn, right, we shouldn't see any impact of attractiveness on whether or not they're getting these interview requests, right? So once again, bad news about society, right? So these are the things we want to fix, but we can identify them. And for some of you, you'll be taking, we'll kind of actually take another look at this, and you'll be learning how do you use data to really identify these issues in Econ 221, if some of you progress on to that class. I'm not going to waste too much time on that, but I did want to, where are we at in time? Okay. Let's see if I can get this to work. I may just post this on, oh yeah, this is old stuff. So I'd have to go back. I think they've redone the links. I'll put a link up on Canvas that has that. It's funny. It's from Comedy Central. It's from the old Daily Show. It's actually, they talk to this economist Hammermesh about this idea of kind of beauty relating to wages. But I just thought there's another interesting example of, we do see that there's discrimination existing. And so we can think about, it's going to look something very similar to this, right? Where maybe it's not cost, but maybe there's benefits, right? So for whatever reason, an employer thinks that someone who's higher up on this attractiveness percentile, they actually don't incur a cost from that, but there's some additional benefit, then they might actually overinflate the demand curve. We'll kind of call this, right, for good-looking individuals, right? Even though that person's productivity is actually much lower, right? If they would pay this like good-looking person a much higher wage, even though their actual addition to the firm, right, in terms of the value of their marginal productivity, is much lower. Right? So it's bad for society. It's also ethically bad. So we would like to eliminate these types of things. Right? These are just some issues we can think about revolving or related to the labor market. I probably won't push you as far as some of the stuff that we've done today on the exam. We'll kind of focus more on anything before today. So Monday, kind of prior. Friday, we'll come in. I'll do some exam review on Monday, and we'll actually get out a little bit early today, unless anybody has any questions for me. So these are the sort of topics you can start thinking about. if you were to kind of progress to the next, next level of economics courses or next level stats courses. Okay. So I'll kind of leave it at that today. Is there anything else I want to mention? So I would start going through those practice problems, making sure that you can understand why the answers are what they are. I think a really good study technique going into this final, identify the questions why you can't even figure out, like, maybe you look at the answer, you got it wrong, but you at least understand why you got it wrong. If you can't understand why, looking at that practice exam, you got the answer wrong, you can't understand why the correct answer is what it is, those are ones that would be good to have questions on. And if you look at those ahead of time, those would be good questions to bring up, in class on Friday and on Monday. Or if you want to kind of stop by my office hours, next week, I'm not going to have any set office hours, but if you want to meet Tuesday before the exam or anytime Monday, I still kind of have courses going on Monday, but Tuesday, anytime, send me an email. We can set up a time to meet. And hopefully, we end this class on kind of a high note, and I want everyone to do as good as possible on this final. Okay. All right. We'll see you guys on Friday.